April 21st, 1945. In a clearing of forest between Duburg and Lintow, Germany, Field Marshal Walter Maud stood alone beneath the trees with his service pistol weighing in his hand. Behind him lay the shattered remains of Army Group B, more than 300,000 men who had surrendered to American units in the days before. Ahead of him was a decision that was not really a choice. He could not dishonor his oath by giving himself up, and he would not allow his countrymen to see him fall into Soviet hands. The shot he fired that afternoon ended one life, and also became a potent emblem of a wider phenomenon that would puzzle military historians for years. Between March and May 1945, nearly 3 million German soldiers surrendered to American and other Western Allied forces, often trudging through their own defensive lines to reach Allied positions, laying down arms without firing, coming out of fortified works with improvised white flags made from sheets or tablecloths. They did not capitulate because their ammunition had vanished or their defenses crumbled, nor simply because the war was lost. They surrendered deliberately and specifically to avoid a single outcome above all others: capture by the Soviet Red Army. The scale of this surrender was unprecedented. From the Allied landings on June 6, 1944, to Hitler's death on April 30, 1945, more than 2.8 million German troops on the northwestern European front gave themselves up to Western forces. Of that total, roughly 1.5 million surrendered in April 1945 alone, about 39,000 per day in the first half of the month, rising to a peak near 59,000 per day in the final 16 days. These men yielded while Hitler still lived, while the Nazi state still operated, and while military law ordered them to fight to the last. They possessed weapons, ammunition, and defensive positions. But they lacked the will to face eastward, where the Red Army tore forward like an implacable instrument of revenge. To explain why so many preferred surrender to continued fighting, one must grasp what German soldiers believed awaited them in Soviet hands. Tales from the East circulated in low voices, slipped through military mail, and arrived with troops transferred west from the Eastern Front. These were eyewitness accounts, not enemy propaganda. Soldiers remembered Stalingrad, where 91,000 men of the 6th Army surrendered in February 1943, and only about 6,000 ever came home, the remainder perishing in the months after surrender from starvation, illness, exposure, and forced labor. They had heard of prisoners driven on death marches into Russia, with inadequate food, water, or rest, and of those shot when they could not keep up. They knew of mining camps in Siberia, of labor detachments in the Urals, and of brutal conditions that killed well over 1 million German captives before 1956. These were not abstract horrors, but grim statistical realities. A post-war West German inquiry documented some 194,250 German prisoners who died in Soviet custody out of roughly 360,000 captured, meaning a German soldier faced better than a 1 in 3 chance of dying even after the guns fell silent. The dread that pushed so many westward ran deeper than mortality figures. It grew from an acute awareness of what German forces had enacted in the Soviet Union. From June 22, 1941, when Operation Barbarossa unleashed the largest military invasion in history, German troops prosecuted what they themselves described as a war of annihilation. Nazi doctrine had branded Slavic peoples as subhumans, fit only for servitude or extermination, and planners conceived programs to starve some 30 million Soviet civilians to carve out Lebensraum for German settlers. The Wehrmacht deliberately allowed the deaths of roughly 3.3 million Soviet prisoners out of 5.7 million taken, a mortality rate near 57%, while by contrast only about 3.5% of British and American POWs died in German custody. German units participated directly in the Holocaust on Soviet soil, where roughly 2 million of the 6 million murdered Jews were killed. They torched villages, executed partisans and suspected partisans and their families, and imposed collective punishments that destroyed whole communities. The blood of some 26 million Soviet soldiers and civilians stained German hands. And every German soldier in 1945, regardless of whether he had personally pulled a trigger or set a blaze, knew or believed he knew, the scale of those crimes. They knew that a Soviet arrival did not simply mean facing another army, but confronting forces bent on exacting righteous retribution for untold offenses. The contrast with American troops was striking. From first contact, German soldiers found an American mode of warfare that shattered the image Nazi propaganda had painted of their foes. Under orders from Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower, American units followed international law for prisoners. They provided medical attention, issued sufficient rations, treated the wounded, and avoided summary executions, torture, or forced labor in breach of the Geneva Conventions. Word of humane treatment spread through German lines faster than any formal dispatch. Men who had surrendered earlier were sometimes held in temporary enclosures visible from German positions. Comrades could see them alive, reasonably well cared for, eating and receiving medical help. That sight proved more persuasive than any official message. When the roughly 317,000 troops trapped in the Ruhr pocket surrendered en masse between April 14th and 18th, 1945, many had weighed their options openly: encirclement with dwindling supplies and the choice either to break out east into Soviet pursuit or to head west toward American lines. Field Marshal Model had dissolved Army Group B rather than formally capitulate, effectively allowing soldiers to pick their own fates, and almost all chose the West. Their decision was not solely about individual survival, but also about preserving the nation. By May 1945, many Germans reckoned that their country's future hinged on Western, especially American, readiness to permit reconstruction instead of imposing Soviet-style occupation and plunder. The spring 1945 rush to surrender had roots months earlier as military reality made defeat unavoidable. After D-Day on June 6, 1944, the Allied presence in Normandy turned the Western Front into a tightening noose. By September, France was liberated, and by December, Allied forces had reached Germany's western frontier despite the temporary reversal of the Battle of the Bulge. On the eastern front, the Soviet juggernaut born from the victory at Stalingrad pushed steadily west. Operation Bagration, launched on June 22, 1944, the third anniversary of Barbarossa, destroyed Army Group Center and inflicted between 400,000 and 450,000 German casualties in 9 weeks, the largest German defeat in the war. By January 1945, Soviet troops were on German soil in East Prussia and within roughly 100 miles of Berlin. Caught between two massive Allied armies, the German military was squeezed, manpower exhausted, factories crippled by strategic bombing, fuel almost gone. Crucially, those two armies promised two different outcomes for captives, and that difference drove German soldiers' desperate choices. German leaders in early 1945 grasped this and tried to exploit it. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who assumed leadership after Hitler's suicide on April 30, 1945, pursued what later historians called a strategy of staged partial surrenders in the West, aiming, according to captured German documents, now in the National Archives, to buy time to move as many Eastern formations westward as possible and hand them intact to British and American forces rather than let them fall into Soviet or Yugoslav custody. Beginning with Italy's surrender on April 29, 1945, Dönitz sought separate terms with Western allies while continuing to resist the Soviets. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery accepted the capitulation of German units in the Netherlands, northwest Germany, and Denmark on May 4th. On May 6th, General Alfred Jodl reached Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force at Reims and offered to lay down arms to the Western Allies while still opposing the Soviets. Eisenhower's reply smashed that plan. He warned he would shut Western lines to German troops, forcing them into Soviet hands unless Germany agreed to unconditional surrender on all fronts at once. Confronted with this ultimatum, Jodl signed the unconditional surrender at 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945 at Reims, ending the fighting in Europe. The Soviets, uneasy at being sidelined, demanded and obtained a second signing in Berlin on May 8th with Soviet participation, which they regarded as the legally binding act. The Battle of Haube stands as perhaps the starkest example of how fiercely German forces tried to escape Soviet capture. From April 24th to May 1st, 1945, the remnants of the German Ninth Army, roughly 200,000 soldiers plus tens of thousands of civilian refugees, found themselves trapped in a shrinking pocket southeast of Berlin under Soviet encirclement. Their commander, General Theodor Busse, ordered a westward breakout toward American lines near the Elbe River because surrendering to the Soviets was widely understood to mean probable death. What followed was catastrophic. Soviet artillery, tanks, and infantry pummeled the pocket without mercy. German troops fought with the raw energy of men desperate to escape rather than to achieve strategic gains, aiming only to pierce the Soviet cordon and reach U.S. positions. Some 30,000 Germans managed to reach American lines, about one-third of those encircled, while overall fatalities, military and civilian combined, have been estimated between 24,000 and 60,000. By contrast, in the Ruhr pocket where mass surrenders were made to American forces, roughly 10,000 people died, including civilians, forced laborers, and irregular fighters, while 317,000 were taken prisoner, a difference that starkly reveals which outcome German soldiers preferred. A post-war German inquiry, led by Erich Maschke Commission, examined the fate of German POWs and concluded that about 3 million were held by the Soviet Union, of whom approximately 194,250 died in captivity between 1941 and 1955. The Commission's breakdown shows 549,360 deaths from 1941 to April 1945 and another 542 to 9/11. From May 1945 to June 1950, figures drawn from both German records and Soviet archives that point to systematic mortality. Overall, the death rate for Germans in Soviet hands exceeded 35%. In contrast, fewer than 1% of men in American custody died. The soldiers surrendering in spring 1945 didn't have access to those exact tabulations, but they grasped the essential reality. Capture by the Soviets meant a high likelihood of death, while capture by Americans generally meant survival. Initial American handling of the flood of prisoners was chaotic and harsh in practice, even if humane in intent. The Rheinwiesenlager, large open-field enclosures hastily set up in April 1945 to hold hundreds of thousands of German captives, struggled to process the unexpected surge. Logistical pressures, processing some 1.5 million prisoners during an active campaign, stretched supplies and shelter thin, and conditions in the earliest weeks were marked by shortages of food and protection as supply lines scrambled to keep up. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force worked to improve the situation, and by the summer of 1945, prisoners were being moved to established camps with proper facilities. The Maschke report places deaths in those temporary enclosures at roughly 4,000 to 6,000, about a 1% mortality rate. Claims of vastly higher American custody deaths, such as the 800,000, 1,000 figure advanced by James Back, have been thoroughly discredited by scholars who demonstrated those numbers, misread administrative records, and transfers as deaths. The speed with which organized German resistance collapsed in the West, compared with the savage fighting that persisted in the East until the last days of the war, underscores this preference to surrender westward. Historian Rudiger Overmann's comprehensive statistical study estimates some 5.3 million German military deaths overall, about 4 million of them on the Eastern Front, roughly 75–80% of total German war dead, versus about 1 million on the Western and other fronts. The intensity and bitter brutality of fighting in the East produced casualty rates far higher than in the West. In the Battle of Berlin alone, April 16, May 2, 1945, German losses were roughly 92,000 to 100,000 killed, 220,000 wounded, and 480,000 captured. The defense was fought block by block with Hitler Youth and Volkssturm alongside Wehrmacht units until ammunition, food, and medical supplies were exhausted and Soviet artillery had gutted the city. On the Western Front, by contrast, many German units with ammunition, positions, and capacity to resist chose not to fight. The Ruhr pocket illustrates that dynamic. From April 1st, when American forces completed the encirclement, until April 18th, when the last resistance ended, German defenders held geographic advantages in an industrial, densely built region that favored defense. Army Group B had some 370,000 men, 19 divisions, sufficient ammunition, and prepared positions. Had they opted for a Stalingrad-style urban defense, American forces would have paid dearly to take the pocket. Instead, mass surrenders began on April 14th after Model dissolved Army Group B. Whole divisions walked into American custody without firing, including veteran formations like the 116th Panzer Division, which, though stripped of serviceable armor and artillery, still had intact infantry capable of resistance. American losses in reducing the Ruhr pocket totaled about 10,000, while 317,000 Germans surrendered, a ratio of fewer than one American casualty per 30 Germans captured, showing that most Germans gave up rather than fight, a pattern repeated across Western Germany in April 1945 as towns and cities raised white flags and units retreated only to surrender at the next encounter, with daily capture rates spelling the story in stark numbers. In March 1945, American and British units were taking roughly 10,000 German prisoners each day. In the first half of April, that rate leapt to about 39,000 daily, and during the last 16 days of April, it climbed to a peak near 59,000 per day. These captures were not all the result of surrounded formations being overrun. Many were voluntary laydowns by units that simply walked away from defensive positions to surrender. The calculation those soldiers made was deliberate. The end was visible, and they had chosen. To stand fast and fight the Americans would only postpone the outcome for a few days and leave them drained when Soviet forces advanced from the east. To fall back toward the east nearly guaranteed eventual capture. By the Red Army, the Western Allies represented their best chance not only to survive the fighting, but to live into whatever post-war Germany might be rebuilt. By May 1945, many Germans of thought concluded that the nation's future depended on Western, especially American, willingness to allow reconstruction rather than imposing Soviet-style occupation. Those who surrendered to American forces were in effect selecting the kind of post-war Germany they hoped to inherit, explaining why German units in the East continued. To resist even as the West collapsed requires recognizing the different meanings of defeat in the two theaters. In the West, surrender usually meant survival. Commanders could justify handing their men over to American custody as a way to preserve lives for Germany's future. In the East, surrender carried no such guarantee. The mortality rate in Soviet captivity meant that yielding to the Red Army could well sentence roughly 1 in 3 men to die. Leaders who had led their troops through years of brutal combat felt unable to consign them to that risk without exhausting every other option. Additionally, each day of resistance in the East could allow more civilians to flee westward ahead of the Soviet advance. The refugee exodus from eastern Germany in early 1945, primarily women, children, and the elderly, moved west by foot. Carts and overcrowded trains carrying what little they could, and soldiers in the East often saw their last duty as buying time for these civilians to escape. This blend of practical calculation, loyalty to the nation, personal fear, and awareness of collective guilt informed surrender choices in 1945. Most men who decided to capitulate to the Americans were not motivated mainly by contrition for wartime crimes, although some acknowledged guilt. They were soldiers making grim survival choices in extreme circumstances. Their preference for American over Soviet captivity reflected a reasoned judgment about which option offered the best chance of living through the collapse. Shaped by their knowledge of German atrocities on the Eastern Front and the likely Soviet response, by what they had observed of American treatment of prisoners, and by expectations about post-war political realities. After the unconditional surrender documents of May 7-8, 1945, some German units kept fighting briefly in hopes of reaching Western Allied lines before the surrender took full effect. Army Group North in the Courland Pocket, cut off since October 1944, did not capitulate to the Soviets until May 9 when the grace period ended. German forces in Czechoslovakia attempted breakouts toward American positions while also fighting Soviet units. The Prague uprising that began on May 5th turned into savage street combat as Czech insurgents and German troops clashed, with German units responding brutally out of fear they would be turned over to the Soviets. Only when American and Soviet forces met and fixed occupation boundaries did the last fighting finally subside. The experience of those who surrendered to the Americans shaped post-war memory and the relationship many former soldiers had with the United States for decades. The harsh but ultimately more humane period in the Rhine-Wiesenlager gave way to improved conditions as prisoners were moved to permanent camps and later repatriated. Most German POWs held by Western allies returned home between 1945 and 1948 to a country devastated by bombing, economic collapse, and division into occupation zones, but returned alive to rebuild, marry and raise families in what became either the Federal Republic in the West or the German Democratic Republic in the East. Many of those who experienced American power firsthand became supporters of Western democracy and the Atlantic Alliance. By contrast, those captured by the Soviets, some 480,000, taken in the Battle of Berlin and over 1 million in the final Eastern campaigns, entered a system oriented toward extracting labor to aid reconstruction after colossal Soviet losses. Some 26 million dead, thousands of towns and factories wrecked. Although Soviet authorities formally invoked Geneva Principles, reconstruction needs and punishment of the vanquished took precedence, and German prisoners were used as forced labor in mines, factories, construction, and agriculture. Conditions improved after the famine years of 1945-46 and mortality fell. But repatriation was slow. Most returned between 1947 and 1950. Yet some did not come home until 1956. 11 years after the war ended. The consequences of these surrender choices reached far beyond individual survival. Nearly 3 million German soldiers who gave themselves up to Western forces formed a human basis for West German society after the war. They returned having seen American organizational competence, military power, and a willingness to treat captives according to rules. Combined with Marshall Plan reconstruction assistance and an American security umbrella against Soviet pressure, these experiences helped orient the Federal Republic toward the West and into NATO. The post-war generation that built West German democracy included many men who had deliberately chosen American captivity rather than fall into Soviet hands. Whether the vast numbers who surrendered in 1945 were ever held to account for participation in Nazi crimes is a fraught question. The great majority faced no prosecution. Trials after the war concentrated on top leaders, SS personnel, concentration camp staff, and those directly tied to specific atrocities, while ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, even veterans of the Eastern Front who had witnessed or taken part in crimes, mostly returned home after imprisonment without legal consequences, allowing millions who had fought for a regime of aggression and genocide to reintegrate into civilian life. The Soviet approach to German captives reflected different aims and experiences. Moscow used POW labor to help rebuild a country devastated by the invasion, keeping prisoners longer, employing them intensively, and releasing them much more slowly than the Western allies. The occupation zones that hardened into East and West Germany meant that a soldier's 1945 surrender often decided which post-war state he would live under. Those who gave themselves up to the West typically ended up in West Germany, while many taken in the East later settled in the East. Viewed across time, the mass German capitulation of 1945 is one of history's most striking military collapses, not because it happened quickly, but because it was selective. German units did not simply quit when defeat was certain. They chose to lay down arms to particular enemies while still resisting others, making mass, pragmatic calculations about survival. The nearly 3 million who surrendered to Western forces were, in effect, voting with their feet and rifles against continued Nazi resistance and against capture by the Soviets. They opted for survival over notions of honor, for the prospect of a future over clinging to the past, and for American pragmatism over Soviet reprisal. The closing record of the war in Europe reflects this divide. Resistance disintegrated in the West, where surrender usually meant life, while fighting persisted in the East, where surrender often meant death. Casualty figures mirror that split. German killed and wounded far outnumbered prisoners on the Eastern Front, while prisoners vastly outnumbered killed and wounded in the West, and the human toll was staggering. Every German soldier killed fighting the Red Army in 1945 might have lived had he faced American troops instead. Every Soviet casualty in 1945 fell fighting Germans, even as mass surrender unfolded in the West. For American units receiving the flood of captives, the scene was both affirming and troubling. It confirmed that German troops recognized American discipline and fairness, but it also made clear that many Germans were fleeing justice as much as seeking mercy. General Eisenhower had to balance alliance obligations with the practical and moral challenges posed by millions at his doorstep. The long-term consequences of those surrender choices were profound. Post-war West Germany, largely populated by men who had surrendered to Western forces, grew into a prosperous democracy and close U.S. ally. While East Germany, shaped in part by those repatriated from Soviet captivity, became a Soviet-style state. When reunification came in 1990, the wartime decisions of millions still cast a shadow over German politics and identity. The Federal Republic's Atlantic orientation, NATO commitment, and Western integration were rooted partly in the experiences of those who had surrendered to Americans and survived. In the stark calculus facing soldiers in 1945, surrender to the West typically meant roughly a 1% chance of death in custody, whereas capture by the Soviets often carried better than a 1 in 3 likelihood of never returning. Given that choice, millions walked west. The roughly 480,000 men taken by the Soviets in the Battle of Berlin had no option to hand themselves to American forces. Surrounded in the capital, they fought on and then suffered the fate their comrades had feared. Those who surrendered